Welcome back to the Home Buyer's Experience, Part 3, Your Offer. In Part 1, before you look, we talked about the 5 areas you need to focus on before you go look at houses. In Part 2, in the house, we talked about the 4 areas you need to focus on when you're actually looking. If you haven't seen these videos, click the links in the description down below. There's a lot of value, and these videos do build on each other. So it's good to see the first one, the second one, and then the third one. When you found the perfect home for you, the key is to get the seller's attention. Convince the seller that you are the best buyer. What's the best buyer? The best buyer has the best price and terms, and most importantly, can follow through on the commitment. There's no value for the seller in a multi-million-dollar offer if the buyer doesn't have the multi-million dollars. Remember, the seller most likely does not know you. It is nothing personal. It's up to you and your real estate team to convince the seller that you are the best buyer. Let's talk about how to do that. The first one I'm going to cover is price. We're going to get this one out of the way because it's the one that everybody thinks about and gets a lot of attention. Purchase price has a big impact on your success rate. No doubt about that. After seeing the house, I'm going to go back and sharpen my pencil. I'm going to come back with a price range, within $5,000, $10,000 and say, this is where I think the house is going to sell. Then it's up to you to make the decision. Do you go above that, in the range, below that? That's completely up to you. In a buyer's market, a lower price offer has a better chance of being accepted. In a seller's market, not so much. That's why it's so important to understand the market conditions like I talked about in part 1 of this series. It makes me think of a client that I worked with. We looked at houses for a while, looked at a lot of houses. We made 14 offers. Every one of those 14 offers was in a multiple offer situation. The first few offers, they were pretty low. We didn't get it. Eventually, he kind of understood what the market conditions were and started listening to my recommendation. We became more and more competitive, but we still were having a tough time because there's more to offers than just the price. Eventually, we did get an offer accepted, the 14th one, and it was because we put the strongest offer together. Pro tip, there are ways to sweeten your offer, including escalation clauses and appraisal gap coverage. Comment down below if you'd like to know a little bit more about those techniques. The second part of the offer that I want to talk about is the down payment. The down payment is the amount of cash that you're basically taking out of your pocket to purchase the house. There are 2 parts. The first part is the earnest money deposit. The earnest money deposit is given to the seller's attorney or agent to put into an escrow account to hold. Think about it as the skin in the game, your incentive to actually close the deal. It's your money. It goes toward the purchase price, but it's held in escrow by the other side as a show of good faith. The second part of that deposit is the actual money that you bring to closing. So although it's a little more complex than this, just giving a very simple example. If you're going to put down 10% on a $300,000 house, that's $30,000. Now the earnest money portion of that $30,000, say that's $10,000. So you're going to write a check for $10,000. Once you get the contract signed, you're going to hand that over to the seller's agent or attorney. They're going to put it in their escrow account. When you go through the rest of the process, we get to the closing table, you're going to bring a check or wire money to your attorney, another $20,000, which the 10 plus 20 equals the $30,000 you're putting down. So that's the earnest money and the deposit. Sellers like to see bigger earnest money and bigger deposits. They view that as someone who can put down more money is more financially stable. Large deposits, to be clear, are not required. There's loans have certain amounts you need to put down, things like that, but you don't need to put 30, 40, 50% down in order to get a house. It is a lever you may be able to pull based on your own situation that can strengthen your offer. The third element of an offer that I want to take a look at is inspections. I always recommend doing a home inspection. I have seen buyers waive home inspections. I don't recommend it. It does make the offer more attractive to a seller, but boy, you're taking on a lot of responsibility and a lot of risk. There are other options that you can follow. Most deals blow up during the inspection phase. Sometimes the buyer gets cold feet or some other reason they want out of the deal and they just use the inspection as the excuse. Other times it's the inspection itself. They find something, they don't want money, they don't want repairs, they just want out. So those are a couple of things that can happen. If you as the buyer want to stay in, one of the things the seller is going to be concerned about is, are you going to come with a long list of expensive repairs? And if that's the case, that can be less than attractive for sellers. So how do you make an offer that has an inspection contingency in it attractive? Well, one thing you can do is you can add an as-is addendum. Now, I'm not an attorney, so I'm just going to quickly summarize. You should always talk to an attorney about the legalese and all that stuff. Bottom line, that particular addendum, the as-is addendum, says you're going to do the inspection, but you're not going to ask for any repairs. The inspection becomes a go or a no-go. You either like it and are staying in, or you don't like it and you're out. You both get some benefits from that. For the buyer side, you get to do the inspection. You get to know what's really going on, or at least you get that third-party look at it. From the seller side, they're a little bit more comfortable knowing that you're not coming with a long list of repairs that need to be done. So you're telling the seller that you're basically not going to nickel and dime them with a bunch of repairs at the end of the day, and that's attractive to sellers. The other option, if you want to follow my suggestion to get a home inspection, but you don't want to use the as-is addendum, is to be very strategic in which inspections you do. There's a couple reasons for this. If you pick a lot of inspections, it's going to cost you a lot more money. Every inspection costs money. The other is applicability. There are some inspections that may not apply. If you have a well and a septic system, those are expensive systems. You're going to want to do the inspections to make sure they're okay. If you don't have a well and septic, then obviously you don't need to do those inspections. Another example is lead paint. If you're buying a house built in the 1940s, 1950s, it may make sense to do a lead paint inspection. If you're buying one from 2001, built in 2001, probably doesn't make sense. Very low probability of lead in that house because lead paint was outlawed in residential properties after 1978. So talk to your real estate agent, talk to your home inspector, pick out the inspections that make the most sense and get the benefit for you that you need. And also don't add ones that don't, because it just adds a little bit more risk for the seller. And again, we want to make you the best buyer choice. The fourth part of the offer that I want to talk about is financing. I'm going to go right ahead and say cash is king. I have seen deals where the seller took a financed offer over a cash offer. So it does happen, but it's not very common. Cash is just simpler and more convenient, and it's more attractive to sellers for a couple of quick reasons. Number one, there's no bank approval required. Often there's no appraisal. The money's in the account. It gets transferred over. You're on your way. So that's one reason. The other reason is you can close a lot faster. Again, there's no underwriting, no appraisal. The attorneys do the title work. The money gets transferred. The deed gets signed and filed, and the deal is done. So those are a couple of reasons why cash is more attractive to sellers. Now, if you're in a situation where financing is what makes sense for you, and it might be even though you have cash, that financing does make sense, not right or wrong, it's just what's right for you. You have to take into account the pros and cons of all the different types of loans that are out there. I can't go into the details of every loan here. The team member that I mentioned in part 1 of this video series, your lender, they're the ones you really need to talk to about which loan is the right one for you. Now, there's conventional loans, there's FHA loans, there's VA and USDA. VA and USDA, you can potentially do a 0% down payment. So that's something that might be attractive at the right time at the right place. There's CHFA loans here in Connecticut. You can get down payment assistance programs. There's renovation loans. There's DSCR, which is debt service coverage ratio loans. There's no doc loans. There's hard money loans. Some loans require homeowner occupancy. Some do not allow homeowner occupancy. Every loan has its own criteria that you have to meet in order to be eligible. Again, work with that real estate team member I talked about in part 1 of this video, the lender. They're going to be the one that's going to be able to tell you best which loan will work for you. I mentioned I've seen sellers who take financed offers over cash offers. Question is, how do you make your offer that's financed more attractive than a cash offer? Well, there's a few things. The first is the pre-approval that I talked about in the first part of this video series. That's the entry-level access. You need to get the VIP access. The VIP access is having your lender get you underwritten and approved. Now, the way that works is the underwriter looks at your documentation. Obviously, they can't look at the house because you don't have one picked out yet, but they approve you as a buyer. Now, all they need to do is go back and review your information again very quickly and then underwrite the house, and then they can move forward. It reduces the underwriting time once the contract is signed. That makes you more flexible in your ability to close earlier, and it also takes away risk from the seller's perspective. So going from a pre-approval to being underwritten is a big one for making your offer stronger. You may also qualify for an appraisal waiver. This depends on your personal financial situation and the property you're looking at. It's not always available, but it's very attractive to a seller if your lender can offer it to you. You have to remember, lenders are very interested in making sure that the property is worth more than the amount that they're lending to you. If the appraisal comes in lower than the purchase price, you're going to be forced to go back and renegotiate with that seller. So if you can get that appraisal waiver, it takes that risk away in the seller's mind, making it a lot more attractive. The final way that a financed offer can be more attractive than a cash offer is by improving other terms. For example, the price, the dates, the inspections, and the concessions. So those are a few ways that you can make an offer that's financed more attractive than a cash offer. The fifth part of the offer that I want to talk about is dates. There are a few key dates in the offer, and being flexible around those dates can break you out as the best buyer. For example, say the seller has some hard constraints around closing date. Maybe they're not going to be ready to move into their new house because it's being built for another 3 months. Showing some flexibility there and pushing the closing date out can make you the best buyer. On the other hand, maybe they've already bought their next house and they're moving into it, or maybe they've already moved into it and they want to close as soon as possible on this house that they're selling because they don't want to pay 2 mortgages. Having that level of flexibility also could break you out as the best seller. Now, there's pros and cons to this, and you could be in a position where you just can't be as flexible as the seller may want. For example, maybe your financing doesn't allow you to close very, very quickly. That's where things like being approved and underwritten can help you, and appraisal waivers can help you. So this all kind of comes together. Also, waiting a longer time, maybe that exposes you to a higher interest rate if we're in a rate climbing environment. So those are the types of things that you need to take into account. It's important to have the pros and cons discussion with your agent. Like I said, one of those team members that you need to listen to when we talked about it in part 1. Talk to your agent about what the pros and cons are, and then you can use dates as another lever to potentially break you out as the best buyer. The sixth part of the offer that I want to talk about is the sale of the buyer's home, commonly referred to as a Hubbard Clause. The reason I'm bringing this up is because it's a reality for many buyers. You may want to move to a new house for whatever reason, but in order to do that, you have to sell your current home. If this is the case, then you're going to have to add this clause to your offer, letting the seller know that you need to sell a house before you can close on the house you're making an offer on. I'm going to be honest with you. It's not necessarily the most attractive clause for a seller to see. If they do accept your offer, they have to wait for you to sell your house before they can close with you on their house. There's obviously some downsides to that. Now, in order to make up for that, sellers are allowed to continue to market their house when they're under a Hubbard Clause. And if they get an offer that does not have a Hubbard Clause on it, then they can come back to you and say, you have 3 days to drop your Hubbard Clause, or you have to walk away from the deal, and I'm going to go with the other offer. So just keep that in mind. If you do end up in a situation where you need to sell a house in order to buy another house, make sure you talk to your agent, make sure you talk to your attorney so you guys can put together a plan for the best way to do that. The final part of offers that I want to talk about here is concessions. This is a bit of a catch-all. There's a lot of things you can do. Break it down into 2 basic categories: seller concessions and buyer concessions. Seller concessions are concessions that the seller gives to the buyer. Buyer concessions are concessions the buyer gives to the seller. For seller concessions, the buyer can ask for closing costs. So say you've got a limited amount of cash or you want to keep some powder dry. So what you can do is if you're going to offer 100,000, you could say offer 103,000 and then ask for 3,000 back in closing costs. Effectively, the seller's getting 100,000. That extra 3,000 is coming back to you to cover the closing costs and prepaids. This is a nice way to protect against running out of cash or leave yourself a little bit of a safety blanket. The risk here is if you go a little too high, you could end up running afoul of the appraisal. So something to think about there. Another thing you can do is you can ask for personal property. So maybe there's a couch, a chair, a lawnmower, something that you want to have them leave behind. You can write that into the contract that says no value, but I want you to leave this behind. That's something the seller would be giving to you. You could also ask them to get a home warranty for you. That's another seller concession, something you're asking from the seller. The final thing you can do, and this doesn't apply everywhere, there's a very unique seller you need to find in order to do this, but you can actually ask them to carry back some paper or a note. You can do some financing. So they could do either a first position or second position seller financing. We can talk a lot more about that, but it is an option in certain cases in very specific sellers. That's another way that you can get some concessions. From a buyer concession perspective, you can offer to cover the seller's closing costs. That could be their real estate costs. That could be their conveyance tax cost. Anything that makes it more attractive to the seller, that's something you could do. Remember, seller concessions, you're asking for things from them, less attractive. Buyer concessions to the seller, more attractive. I did this, I've done this a bunch of times, but I did it one time specifically. I was buying a house. The seller was in a terrible position. They owed a lot of money on the house. They had liens, all this other stuff. They were going to have to bring money to closing in order to close. So I offered to cover their conveyance tax, and that got them to the point where they're just about break even, and it enabled us to do the deal and move forward. So it is something that you can do. Another option is you can offer to have the seller leave behind personal property that they don't want. You might see that your possessions kind of build up over time. That costs money, it takes time, it takes effort to get all that out of a house. So if you can offer to say, look, just leave behind whatever you don't want, I'll take care of it, that might be something that makes your offer a little bit more attractive to particular sellers. There's so many ways to strengthen an offer. Some will work for you and some won't. The best approach is going to be based on your situation, the seller, and the property. Bottom line is, the stronger your offer is, the more likely the seller is going to see you as the best buyer, and that's your goal. What ways have you seen people make offers stronger? In part 4 of the Home Buyer's Experience, we're going to cover what happens from when your contract is accepted until you get to the closing table. I tell my clients, once you have an accepted contract, you and the seller are pretty much on the same team. You have a common goal. You both want to meet the terms of the contract and get to the closing table. If you haven't seen parts 1 and 2, the links are in the description below. Click on those and check them out. It's critical to follow the process from start to finish to get the best result.